Black journalist's investigation uncovers hidden community hero. Get back! Everyone get back! Eleanor Jenkins shouted, her press badge swinging wildly as she positioned herself between the angry crowd and the frail elderly man they were advancing upon. The rain poured mercilessly, soaking through her coat as lightning illuminated the faces of the mob. 73-year-old Walter Coleman stood trembling behind her, his weathered hands clutching a worn leather satchel to his chest. He's a fraud. A thief who's been lying to this community for decades. A man from the crowd yelled, his voice carrying above the storm. Others joined in, their accusations growing more venomous by the second. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. After 30 years as a journalist, she'd never found herself physically defending a subject of her investigation. The irony wasn't lost on her. 2 weeks ago, she'd come to Millfield to expose Walter Coleman herself. Now she was his only shield against a community consumed by misplaced rage. "You don't understand," Eleanor pleaded, her voice breaking. "The documents in that satchel, they prove everything." Walter's eyes met hers, filled with a resignation that broke her heart. "Perhaps it's time, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Maybe some truths aren't meant to be protected." As the crowd closed in, Eleanor felt her phone vibrate. The message that flashed across the screen changed everything. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Eleanor Jenkins first discovered the truth that would turn an entire community upside down. Eleanor Jenkins adjusted her rearview mirror as she drove down Maple Street, taking in the familiar sights of her hometown. At 58, she'd spent the last 3 decades building a respected career as an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune, but Millfield, Virginia would always be home. The late September sun filtered through trees beginning their autumn transformation, casting dappled shadows across the road. She'd returned to Millfield reluctantly, drawn back by an anonymous tip that landed in her inbox 2 weeks ago. The message was brief but compelling. Walter Coleman is not who he claims to be. The beloved philanthropist of Millfield has built his legacy on lies. Come home, Eleanor. The truth deserves to be told. Eleanor had been skeptical at first. Walter Coleman was practically a living saint in Millfield, the elderly black man who transformed the struggling town over the past 40 years through his charitable foundation. The Coleman Community Center, the college scholarship program for low-income students, the medical clinic that served those without insurance, all funded by Walter's seemingly boundless generosity. As Eleanor parked outside Daisy's diner, she thought about her editor's reaction when she'd pitched this story. A small-town hero with a secret past? It's been done to death, Jenkins. But something about the tip felt personal, as though whoever sent it knew she couldn't resist a hometown mystery. The bell above the diner door jingled as Eleanor entered, and the familiar scent of coffee and homemade pie enveloped her. The interior hadn't changed since the 1970s, red vinyl booths, chrome-edged tables, and a jukebox in the corner currently playing Fleetwood Mac's Dreams. "Well, I'll be Eleanor Jenkins as I live and breathe." Daisy Harper, now in her 70s with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, emerged from behind the counter. Her apron was the same style she'd worn when Eleanor was a teenager coming in for milkshakes after school. "Hello, Daisy," Eleanor smiled, accepting the older woman's warm embrace. "Still making the best apple pie in 3 counties. You know it," Daisy winked. "Though these days my granddaughter does most of the baking. My arthritis doesn't much care for rolling dough anymore." She gestured toward a booth. "Sit, sit. What brings our famous journalist back to Millfield?" "Last I heard, you were in Washington covering some big political scandal." Eleanor slid into the booth, setting her worn leather messenger bag beside her. "Just visiting. Thought I'd reconnect with old friends, maybe write a piece about how small towns are faring in today's economy." It wasn't entirely a lie, but Eleanor had learned long ago that revealing her true investigative targets too early often closed doors before she could get through them. "Well, you picked a good time." The Fall Festival starts tomorrow, Walter Coleman's big annual community celebration. 40 years he's been funding that event. Daisy poured coffee without asking if Eleanor wanted some. Some rituals never needed confirmation. "How is Walter these days?" Eleanor asked casually, adding cream to her coffee. Daisy's expression softened. "Bless his heart, he's slowing down at 73, but still shows up everywhere. You know, without that man, Millfield would have dried up when the factory closed in '83. He single-handedly saved this town." Eleanor nodded, remembering the economic devastation when Millfield manufacturing shuttered, leaving hundreds unemployed. She'd been a teenager then, watching her father struggle to find work. Walter Coleman had emerged seemingly from nowhere, establishing his foundation and gradually rebuilding the town's economy and spirit. "I'd love to interview him for my piece," Eleanor said. "Do you know where I might find him today?" "Try the community center. Thursday afternoons, he still reads to the children in the library section." Daisy refilled Eleanor's coffee. "Though if you're hoping for a long interview, you might be disappointed. Walter's become quite private these past few years, hardly gives interviews anymore." Eleanor thanked her and spent another 20 minutes catching up before heading to her car. As she drove toward the Coleman Community Center, she mentally reviewed what little she knew about Walter's background. He'd arrived in Millfield in the early 1980s, a middle-aged man with apparent wealth and a desire to help. The official story was that he'd made his fortune in real estate in Detroit, then chose Millfield for his retirement and philanthropic efforts. But details about his life before Millfield were suspiciously scarce, and Eleanor's preliminary research had revealed inconsistencies in his background. The Coleman Community Center stood as the crown jewel of Walter's contributions to Millfield, a sprawling two-story brick building that housed a library, gymnasium, art studios, and meeting spaces. A large sign over the entrance read, "Everyone belongs here," and even on a Thursday afternoon, the parking lot was nearly full. Inside, Eleanor followed the sound of an elderly man's voice to the children's section of the library, where Walter Coleman sat in a worn armchair surrounded by about 15 children seated cross-legged on a colorful rug. His silver hair contrasted with his dark skin, and wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose as he read from Where the Wild Things Are, a book Eleanor remembered from her own childhood. Walter's voice was gentle but expressive, rising and falling with the story's rhythm, holding the children in rapt attention. Eleanor hung back, observing the scene. Nothing about the kind-faced elderly man suggested deception or fraud. But Eleanor had learned throughout her career that the most convincing facades often hid the most significant secrets. After finishing the story and answering eager questions from the children, Walter noticed Eleanor standing at the edge of the room. He said something to the librarian, then made his way over, leaning slightly on a wooden cane. "You're a new face, or rather an old one returned," he said with a warm smile, extending his hand. "Walter Coleman." "Eleanor Jenkins," she replied, shaking his hand and noting his firm grip despite his age. "I grew up here, though I left for college and never really came back except for short visits." Recognition flickered in Walter's eyes. "Jenkins, was your father Thomas Jenkins?" "Worked at the factory?" Eleanor nodded, surprised. "Yes, he was." Walter's smile widened. "Good man, your father, one of the hardest workers I knew when I first came to town. He passed some years back, if I recall." 10 years ago, Eleanor confirmed, a familiar pang of loss surfacing briefly. "You have a good memory." "Names and faces stick with me," Walter said. "Now, what brings you to the community center today?" "You look too young to be retiring to Millfield, and too old to be one of our story time regulars." His eyes twinkled with gentle humor. "I'm a journalist with the Chicago Tribune," Eleanor explained. "I'm working on a piece about small towns that have successfully reinvented themselves after economic hardship. Millfield is something of a case study, largely thanks to your foundation." Something subtle shifted in Walter's expression, a guardedness that wouldn't be noticeable to someone less trained in reading people. "Is that so? Well, I'm afraid you've caught me on a busy day. The fall festival preparations are in full swing." "I understand. Perhaps we could schedule a time tomorrow. I'd love to hear more about what inspired your philanthropic work." Eleanor maintained eye contact, watching for his reaction. Walter hesitated. "I don't do many interviews these days, Ms. Jenkins. My work speaks for itself, and at my age, I value my privacy." "Of course," Eleanor nodded. "Even a short conversation would be helpful, and please call me Eleanor." After another moment's consideration, Walter relented. "Very well, Eleanor, come by my home tomorrow morning at 9. I can spare an hour before my festival duties begin." He wrote his address on a slip of paper and handed it to her. "Thank you, I appreciate it," Eleanor said, tucking the paper into her bag. Walter studied her face for a moment. "You have your father's eyes," he remarked quietly. "Observant, always looking beneath the surface." With that cryptic comment, he excused himself to speak with the librarian. Eleanor left the community center with mixed feelings. Walter Coleman seemed every bit the benevolent community leader people described. Yet something in his reluctance to be interviewed, the careful way he spoke, reinforced her suspicions that there was more to his story. Checking into the Millfield Inn, a small hotel renovated as part of the town's revitalization, Eleanor spent the evening reviewing her notes and preparing questions for the interview. The anonymous tip had included no specific allegations, just the claim that Walter's past wasn't what he claimed. Eleanor needed more. On a hunch, she called an old contact at the Detroit Public Records office. "Eleanor Jenkins, it's been what, 3 years since you needed dirt on that industry executive?" Boomed the voice of Harold Wilson, a records clerk who'd helped her on previous investigations. "Something like that, Harold. I'm hoping you can help me again." Eleanor explained that she needed information on Walter Coleman's real estate dealings in Detroit during the 1970s and early 1980s. Coleman, Harold muttered, and Eleanor could hear keyboard clicking in the background. "I'm not finding much here, Eleanor." No major real estate transactions under that name during that period. "Are you sure about the details?" Eleanor frowned. "That's what he claims. Made his fortune in Detroit real estate before moving to Virginia around 1983. Well, either he used another name or that story doesn't check out. Want me to dig deeper? Might take a few days." "Please do, Harold. And could you check for any Walter Colemans in Detroit during that period, regardless of occupation?" "Criminal records, birth records, anything?" Harold promised to search and get back to her. Hanging up, Eleanor felt the familiar tingle of a story beginning to unfold. Walter Coleman's claimed fortune from Detroit real estate might be the first confirmed inconsistency in his narrative. Such a blessing to this town. "Let me show you our special collection on his contributions." She led Eleanor to a glass display case containing newspaper clippings, photographs, and ceremonial items like ribbon-cutting scissors and commemorative plaques, all documenting Walter Coleman's 4 decades of philanthropy. "The earliest mention should be around 1983, Patricia explained, pointing to a yellowed newspaper clipping. "That's when he first purchased the old Wilson property and announced plans for the community center." Eleanor examined the article, dated July 1983. It described Walter Coleman as a successful businessman from Detroit who chose Millfield for his retirement and philanthropic endeavors. The accompanying photograph showed a younger Walter, perhaps in his early 40s, cutting a ribbon at the property that would become the community center. His smile was the same, but there was something different about his eyes, a wariness that contrasted with the confident posture. "Do you have anything from before this? Any articles about his arrival or background?" Eleanor asked. Patricia shook her head. "Not much. Mr. Coleman was quite private when he first came to town. Some folks were suspicious, of course, a well-to-do black man appearing out of nowhere in a predominantly white small town in the early 80s. But once he started creating jobs and opportunities, those suspicions faded pretty quickly." Eleanor spent the next hour reviewing every article mentioning Walter from 1983 through 1985. The narrative was consistent. A successful businessman using his fortune to revitalize a struggling town. Yet details about his past remained frustratingly vague in every account. As she was about to leave, Eleanor noticed a small photo album on a bottom shelf labeled Millfield Manufacturing, the final years 1981-983. Curious about the connection to her father's former workplace, she began flipping through it. Most photographs documented the factory's decline, machinery being removed, workers at their final shifts, the building standing empty. But one photo near the end caught her attention. It showed a group of community leaders meeting to discuss the town's future after the factory closure. In the background, partially obscured but unmistakable, stood Walter Coleman, at least a year before his official arrival in Millfield. Eleanor checked the photo's date, March 1982. She quickly took a picture of it with her phone, her journalist's instincts buzzing. If Walter had been in Millfield before his supposed arrival from Detroit, what else about his story might be untrue? The town square was transformed for the fall festival when Eleanor arrived shortly after noon. Colorful booths lined the perimeter, offering local crafts, food, and games. A stage at the center featured a band playing covers of 1960s folk songs, and children ran about with painted faces and cotton candy. Eleanor spotted Walter near the community center's booth, speaking with volunteers. He moved with purpose despite his age, checking details and greeting townspeople with genuine warmth. Watching him, Eleanor found it difficult to reconcile the beloved community figure with the increasingly suspicious gaps in his background. "First time at our festival." A voice beside her interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor turned to find a man about her age with salt and pepper hair and a police chief's badge reading Michael Hayes. "Mike Hayes," Eleanor smiled with recognition. "You used to pull my pigtails in 3rd grade." The police chief's eyes widened. "Eleanor Jenkins, I heard rumors you were back in town, still chasing stories and causing trouble." "Something like that," Eleanor admitted. Congratulations on the badge. Your dad would be proud. Mike's father had been Millfield's police chief throughout their childhood. Following in his footsteps was the easy part, Mike said. Keeping up with his reputation is the challenge. So what brings our famous investigative journalist home? Not just nostalgia, I'm guessing. Eleanor hesitated, then decided a partial truth might be useful. I'm researching a piece on Walter Coleman and his impact on Millfield. Mike's expression shifted subtly. Walter, man's a local hero. So everyone keeps telling me. Did you know him when he first arrived? Mike considered this. Not well. I was away at college when he first showed up. By the time I returned to join the police force, he was already established. Why? Eleanor lowered her voice. Have you ever looked into his background, where his money really came from? Mike raised an eyebrow. That sounds less like a puff piece and more like an investigation. Any particular reason you're suspicious of a man who's done nothing but good for this town? Professional curiosity, Eleanor said. Something doesn't add up about his Detroit real estate story. Mike glanced around, then led Eleanor to a quieter spot near the edge of the square. Look, I don't know what you're chasing, Eleanor, but treading carefully might be wise. Walter Coleman isn't just another rich guy doing charity work. He's the backbone of Millfield's economy. Half the town either works for his foundation or benefits directly from its programs. All the more reason to ensure everything is above board, Eleanor countered. Mike sighed. I'll tell you this much, about 15 years ago when I first made detective, I got curious myself. Walter's story seemed too good to be true, and I've always been suspicious by nature. What did you find? Eleanor asked eagerly. Nothing concrete, but there were inconsistencies in his timeline, and I could never verify his Detroit connections. I started asking more questions, and suddenly the mayor and town council were concerned about my misallocation of police resources. The message was clear: leave Walter Coleman alone. Eleanor frowned. That sounds like more than just protecting a town benefactor. Maybe, Mike conceded. Or maybe they were right. What good would come from discrediting the man who saved Millfield? Would revealing some past indiscretion be worth destroying everything he's built here? Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion near the stage drew their attention. Walter had taken the microphone and was preparing to speak. The crowd quickly gathered, their faces upturned with obvious admiration. Friends and neighbors, Walter began, his rich voice carrying across the square. 40 years ago, I came to Millfield seeking a quiet place to call home. What I found instead was a community of remarkable resilience facing its darkest hour. When the factory closed, you didn't give up on each other or on this town. The crowd murmured in agreement, many nodding at the shared memory. The Coleman Foundation has never been about one man's vision, Walter continued. It's about recognizing the potential that was already here and providing the resources to let it flourish. Every success we celebrate today belongs to all of us, to the teachers who stayed when they could have left, to the business owners who took risks when it seemed foolish, to the young people who chose to build their futures here rather than elsewhere. Eleanor watched the faces in the crowd, the genuine emotion, the pride in what they'd collectively accomplished. Whatever secrets Walter might be hiding, his impact on these people was undeniably positive. This year's festival theme is honoring our past, building our future, Walter said. As I look around at what we've built together, I'm filled with hope for Millfield's next chapter, though I may not be here to see it all unfold. He paused, and a murmur of concern rippled through the audience. Yes, friends, at 73, I must acknowledge that my time of active leadership is drawing to a close. This year, I'll be transitioning more responsibility to the Foundation's board and our new executive director, James Williams. Walter gestured to a younger black man in his 40s standing nearby, who acknowledged the crowd with a respectful nod. But today is for celebration, not farewells, Walter concluded. Please enjoy the festival, connect with old friends, and make new ones. This community's greatest strength has always been the bonds between its people. As applause erupted, Eleanor noticed something unexpected. Tears in Walter's eyes quickly blinked away before he stepped down from the stage. Not tears of sentiment, she thought, but something deeper. Something that looked almost like relief mixed with regret. As the crowd dispersed back to the festival activities, Eleanor's phone rang. The screen showed Harold Wilson from the Detroit Records office. Eleanor, I found something, Harold said without preamble when she answered. There's no record of a Walter Coleman making significant real estate deals in Detroit during the period you mentioned. But I did find a Walter Coleman in the Detroit area during the 1970s, a factory worker at an auto plant. Eleanor's pulse quickened. That doesn't match the profile of someone who made millions in real estate. No, it doesn't, Harold agreed. But here's where it gets interesting. This Walter Coleman disappears from records around 1978. No death certificate, no further employment records, just gone. As if he left Detroit and became someone else, Eleanor mused. Possibly. There's one more thing. I found a Detroit News article from 1978 about a major embezzlement case at First Michigan Bank. The lead suspect was the bank's investment manager, a man named Walter. Harold paused, checking his notes. Walter Evans. He disappeared with nearly $2 million and was never found. Eleanor's mind raced with possibilities. Was there a photograph with the article? No, just a physical description. African-American male, early 30s, approximately 6 feet tall, nothing particularly distinctive. Can you send me everything you've found? Eleanor asked. Already on its way to your email, Harold replied. There's not much on the embezzlement case. It was big news for a few weeks, then faded away. Banks didn't always publicize their security breaches back then. Eleanor thanked him and hung up, her journalistic instincts fully engaged now. Could Walter Coleman actually be Walter Evans, a man who embezzled money from a Detroit bank and used it to reinvent himself in Millfield? The timing aligned, the embezzlement in 1978, a few years possibly spent hiding or moving around, then appearing in Millfield around 1982-83 with unexplained wealth. It would explain the inconsistencies in his background, his reluctance to discuss his past, and even his seemingly limitless generosity, perhaps born from guilt as much as goodwill. But proving such a connection would be difficult after more than 40 years, and Eleanor found herself wrestling with an ethical dilemma. If Walter Coleman was indeed Walter Evans, he'd used the stolen money to transform countless lives for the better. Would exposing him now serve any purpose beyond destroying his legacy and harming the town that depended on him? Lost in thought, Eleanor didn't notice James Williams, the man Walter had introduced as the foundation's new executive director, approaching her. Ms. Jenkins, I'm James Williams. He extended his hand with a professional smile. Mr. Coleman mentioned you're working on an article about Millfield's revitalization. I'd be happy to provide any information about the foundation's current initiatives. Eleanor shook his hand, noting his polished demeanor and careful phrasing. Thank you, Mr. Williams. I'm particularly interested in the foundation's early days. How long have you worked with Mr. Coleman? Nearly 15 years, James replied. I started as a program coordinator after graduating from college, one of the first recipients of the Coleman Scholarship, actually. Walter has been a mentor as well as an employer. He must trust you a great deal to hand over the reins, Eleanor observed. Something flashed in James's eyes, a hint of the same guardedness she'd seen in Walter. The transition has been planned for some time. Walter has always intended for the foundation to outlive him. Has he shared much about his life before Millfield, his time in Detroit, for instance? James's smile remained fixed, but his posture stiffened slightly. Walter is a private person. Our conversations have focused on the foundation's work, not personal histories. He checked his watch. If you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for the Community Service Awards ceremony. Perhaps we can continue this conversation another time. As James walked away, Eleanor felt increasingly certain that a protective circle existed around Walter Coleman, people who either knew his secrets or suspected them but had chosen loyalty over disclosure. The festival continued into the afternoon as Eleanor wandered through the booths, half observing the community interactions while processing the information from Harold. She needed more evidence before confronting Walter again, something concrete that could either confirm her suspicions or put them to rest. Her opportunity came unexpectedly when she overheard two elderly volunteers discussing Walter's apparent fatigue. He forgot his medication again, one said to the other. Angela from the pharmacy had to deliver it to his house this morning. Third time this month, the other replied. I'm worried about him living alone, especially with his memory slipping. Eleanor approached them with a friendly smile. Excuse me, I couldn't help overhearing. You're talking about Walter Coleman? I'm Eleanor Jenkins, working on a feature about his contributions to Millfield. The women introduced themselves as Marge and Betty, longtime friends of Walter and volunteers for various foundation programs. We've known Walter for decades, Marge said proudly. Remarkable man, never married, dedicated his whole life to this community. Do you know why he chose Millfield specifically? Eleanor asked. He must have had many options for where to settle. The women exchanged glances. He never said exactly, Betty answered. Though I remember him mentioning once that he'd passed through during a difficult time in his life and found kindness here. When was that? Before he moved here officially? Another glance between them. Must have been, Marge said vaguely. Look at the time, Betty. We're due at the pie contest judging. As they hurried away, Eleanor sensed they knew more than they were sharing. The comment about Walter's memory slipping, however, gave her an idea. His mental acuity was declining with age. Perhaps his carefully maintained narrative might have cracks she could explore. The afternoon progressed, and dark clouds began gathering on the horizon, threatening the outdoor festivities. Eleanor continued observing Walter from a distance as he made his rounds through the festival, always surrounded by appreciative townspeople. Despite his announced transition from leadership, it was clear his personal connection to the community remained the foundation's greatest asset. Around 4 o'clock, as vendors began preparing for the possibility of rain, Eleanor's phone rang again. This time it was Patricia from the library. "Eleanor, you asked about Walter Coleman's early days in Millfield," she said, her voice hushed despite the festival noise in the background. "I remembered something after you left. There's a retired reporter from the Millfield Gazette, Samuel Winters, who might know more. He covered everything in this town from the 60s through the 90s. Is he still local?" Eleanor asked eagerly. "Lives in the Riverside retirement home on Oak Street. But Eleanor," Patricia hesitated. "Sam's had a few strokes. His memory comes and goes. Some days he's sharp as ever, other days he barely recognizes his own children." Eleanor thanked her for the information and immediately headed to her car. The Riverside retirement home was only a 10-minute drive from the town square, and if Samuel Winters had covered Walter's arrival in Millfield, he might have uncovered information that never made it into print. The retirement home was a pleasant, single-story building surrounded by gardens. At the reception desk, Eleanor identified herself as a journalist hoping to speak with Samuel Winters about Millfield's history. "Mr. Winters is having one of his good days," the receptionist told her. "But please keep the visit brief. Too much excitement can be taxing for him." She led Eleanor to a sunroom where a thin, white-haired man sat in a wheelchair gazing out at the approaching storm. Despite his frail appearance, his eyes were alert and interested when the receptionist introduced Eleanor. "A journalist from Chicago?" Samuel's voice was surprisingly strong. "Come to learn from an old newsman, have you?" "Pull up a chair, young lady." Eleanor sat beside him, explaining her interest in Millfield's revitalization after the factory closure, particularly Walter Coleman's role. Samuel's expression sharpened at the mention of Walter's name. "Coleman," he repeated. "Now there's a story I never fully told." "What do you mean?" Eleanor leaned forward. Samuel glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Every town has its unwritten understandings, stories we don't pursue out of respect or necessity. Walter Coleman was one of mine. Because of all the good he's done for Millfield," Eleanor suggested. Samuel's eyes, faded blue but still penetrating, studied her face. "Partly, but also because of Thomas." "Thomas, my father?" Eleanor asked, startled. Samuel nodded slowly. "Your father and Walter had a connection. Thomas never wanted it publicized, and I respected his wishes." Eleanor's mind reeled. "What kind of connection? Did they know each other before Walter came to Millfield?" Samuel looked troubled, as if regretting having said so much. "Perhaps I shouldn't be the one to tell this story. Have you spoken with Walter directly?" "Yes, but he was reluctant to discuss his past," Eleanor explained. "Mr. Winters, if you know something about Walter Coleman's true background, especially if it involves my father, I need to hear it. As a journalist and as Thomas's daughter." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the ticking of a wall clock and distant thunder. Finally, he sighed. "It was before Walter officially arrived in town. Must have been early '82. I was working late at the Gazette office when Thomas Jenkins came to see me. He had a man with him, younger then, of course, but unmistakably Walter Coleman." Eleanor listened intently as Samuel continued. "Thomas asked me to keep their visit off the record. Said the man with him needed a fresh start and might bring good things to Millfield if given the chance. I knew your father wasn't one for dramatic statements, so his conviction made an impression." "Did he explain why Walter needed a fresh start?" Eleanor pressed. Samuel's gaze drifted to the window. "Not explicitly, but there was an understanding. The early '80s were difficult times for Millfield. The factory closing left families desperate. Some good men made choices they wouldn't ordinarily make." "Are you saying my father was involved in something illegal with Walter?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight. Samuel's focus returned sharply. "No, no. Thomas Jenkins was the most honest man I knew. What I'm saying is that Thomas believed in second chances. He saw something in Walter worth protecting." He paused. "Your father worked at the First Michigan Bank in Detroit before moving back to Millfield in the late '70s, did he not?" The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Her father had indeed worked at a bank in Detroit before returning to Millfield when she was a child. She'd always understood it was because his mother, Eleanor's grandmother, had been ill and needed care. "Are you suggesting my father knew Walter in Detroit, that he knew about the embezzlement?" Eleanor asked, connecting the pieces. Samuel looked surprised. "You know about the missing money. I have sources in Detroit," Eleanor said. "They found records of an embezzlement case involving someone named Walter Evans." Samuel nodded slowly. "Yes, that was the name. I did my own research back then, quietly. Never published it. But why would my father help someone who stole money?" Eleanor asked, struggling to reconcile this with her memory of her principled, honest father. "That's the part of the story I don't know," Samuel admitted. "Thomas only said that things weren't as they appeared and that Walter deserved a chance to make amends in his own way." His voice grew weaker. "The next time I saw Walter, he was purchasing the old Wilson property, announcing plans for the community center. By then, he was Walter Coleman, and no one questioned where his money came from. Results speak louder than origins, especially in a town fighting for survival." Eleanor sat back, processing this information. Her father, who'd taught her the importance of truth and integrity, had apparently helped Walter Evans become Walter Coleman, possibly protecting him from prosecution for embezzlement. "There's one more thing," Samuel said, his energy visibly fading. "Walter has a safe in his home office. Thomas mentioned it once, said if anything ever happened to Walter, someone needed to know about the contents, called it the full accounting." Before Eleanor could ask more questions, a nurse appeared, noting Samuel's increased fatigue and ending the visit. As Eleanor thanked him and prepared to leave, Samuel grasped her wrist with surprising strength. "Whatever you discover, remember that good people sometimes make complicated choices," he said earnestly. "Your father and Walter both." The storm was breaking as Eleanor drove back toward town, rain pelting her windshield and thunder rumbling overhead. Her mind was a similar storm of questions and conflicting emotions. Had her father been complicit in covering up a crime? Or was there more to the story, some justification that explained his actions? She needed to speak with Walter again, this time with direct questions about Walter Evans, the embezzlement, and her father's involvement. But first, she wanted to see what evidence might exist in the safe Samuel had mentioned. Eleanor drove past the festival, where workers were hurriedly dismantling booths and tents as the storm intensified. Walter's house appeared dark when she arrived, suggesting he was still at the festival or perhaps seeking shelter elsewhere as the weather worsened. She sat in her car, contemplating her next move. Breaking into Walter's home was illegal and unethical, regardless of her journalistic pursuit. Yet if the safe contained evidence of a 40-year-old crime in which her father might be implicated, she felt entitled to that truth. As rain hammered on the roof of her car, Eleanor made her decision. She would return to the festival, find Walter, and confront him directly with what she knew. Professional ethics and personal integrity demanded nothing less. The town square was in disarray when Eleanor arrived, with festival-goers rushing to their vehicles and volunteers struggling to secure equipment against the strengthening wind. She spotted James Williams directing the effort, but saw no sign of Walter. "Mr. Williams," she called, approaching him through the rain. "Where's Walter Coleman?" James looked harried. "He left about 20 minutes ago. Said he needed to secure some documents at his home before the worst of the storm hit." He gave her a curious look. "Why? I need to speak with him urgently," Eleanor said. "It's about Walter Evans and the First Michigan Bank." James's expression changed instantly, alarm replacing annoyance. "Who told you that name?" "So you know," Eleanor realized. "You know he's not who he claims to be." James grabbed her arm, pulling her under the shelter of a nearby tent. "Whatever you think you know, Ms. Jenkins, I strongly advise you to let it go. Walter Coleman has spent 40 years atoning for the mistakes of Walter Evans." "By using stolen money?" Eleanor challenged. "By using every penny of that money to help others rather than himself," James countered. "Look around you. Everything you see, the revitalized businesses, the community center, the scholarships, all from a choice he made to give rather than keep. The law doesn't make exceptions for good intentions after the fact," Eleanor pointed out. James's expression hardened. "The statute of limitations on that crime expired decades ago. The only thing you'll accomplish by exposing him now is destroying a lifetime of good work and breaking the heart of every person in this town who believes in him." A loud crack of thunder punctuated his words, followed by a sudden intensification of the rain. "There's more to this story," Eleanor insisted. "My father was involved somehow. I need to understand why." James looked surprised. "Your father, Thomas Jenkins?" He shook his head. "I don't know anything about that. Walter has never mentioned your father to me." Eleanor believed him. "I need to speak with Walter now." James hesitated, then nodded. Go to his house. But Eleanor approached this as a daughter seeking truth, not a journalist seeking headlines. Walter is an old man who's given everything to this community. He deserves dignity, whatever you decide to do with what you learn. Eleanor drove back to Walter's house through streets that were beginning to flood in the downpour. This time, lights shone from inside. She parked and ran to the porch, already soaked by the time she rang the doorbell. No answer came. She rang again, then tried the door handle. To her surprise, it was unlocked. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before entering, calling Walter's name as she stepped into the foyer. The house was quiet except for the sound of the storm outside. A light was on in what appeared to be an office down the hall. Eleanor moved toward it, calling Walter's name again. She found him in the office, kneeling before an open safe built into the wall behind his desk. Walter turned at her entrance, his expression shifting from surprise to resignation when he recognized her. "Eleanor," he said quietly, rising slowly to his feet. "I suppose it was inevitable that Thomas's daughter would eventually uncover the truth." "Walter Evans," Eleanor said, using his original name. Walter nodded, neither denying the identity nor showing alarm at her knowledge. "Yes. Though I haven't been that man for a very long time. You embezzled nearly $2 million from First Michigan Bank in 1978, Eleanor stated. Money you've been using to fund your foundation and your philanthropy here in Millfield." "That's correct," Walter acknowledged, his calm acceptance surprising her. "Though the actual amount was $1,732,000, I've accounted for every penny in these records." Gestured to the safe, where Eleanor could see neatly organized folders and ledgers. "My father helped you," Eleanor said. "Why, he was the most honest man I knew. Why would he help cover up a crime?" Walter's expression softened. "Because Thomas Jenkins was indeed the most honest man either of us has known, and because I didn't steal that money, Eleanor, your father did." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Eleanor staggered slightly, gripping the edge of the desk for support. "No," she said. "I don't believe you." Walter moved to a chair, lowering himself with the weariness of age and long-carried secrets. "Please sit. You deserve the full truth, and it's past time it was told." Eleanor remained standing, her journalist's instincts battling with personal shock. "Explain." Walter nodded. "Thomas was an investment manager at First Michigan Bank. I was a teller, a young man with a basic education who'd worked his way up from the factory floor to a position in finance. Thomas took an interest in me, mentored me. We became friends despite our differences in position and background." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "In 1978, Thomas discovered that the bank was involved in predatory lending practices targeting black neighborhoods in Detroit. Redlining was still common then, but this went beyond that. Deliberate manipulation of interest rates, hidden fees, terms designed to ensure default and property seizure. Thomas gathered evidence, took it to the bank president, believing the practices were happening without senior leadership's knowledge. And, Eleanor prompted when Walter paused, he was told to mind his own business. Worse, he was implicated. Some of the fraudulent investments had been processed through his department with his electronic signature forged on documents. He was given a choice: stay quiet or face prosecution himself, possibly serving as the scapegoat for the entire scheme. Eleanor slowly sank into a chair across from Walter, her mind racing. "So he took the money as, what? Revenge? Compensation?" Walter shook his head. "Justice, as he saw it. He calculated the approximate damages to the communities affected, just under $2 million. Then he created a ghost account, gradually transferring funds to it over several months. His plan was to return the money directly to the affected neighborhoods through community organizations and development projects." "But something went wrong," Eleanor guessed. "Yes, someone in the bank grew suspicious. An audit was scheduled. Thomas knew he'd be discovered." Walter's eyes grew distant with the memory. "He came to me, confessed everything, asked if I would help him finish what he'd started." "Why you?" "Because I was from one of those neighborhoods, because he trusted me, and because he knew I had nothing to lose while he had everything: a wife, a young daughter, a reputation in the community." Eleanor's throat tightened. "You took the blame, became Walter Evans, the embezzler." Walter nodded. "Thomas transferred the money one final time to accounts under my name. I disappeared. He returned to Millfield with his family, claiming his mother's illness as the reason for the move. A convenient truth: she was indeed ill, though not the only motivation." "And the money?" Eleanor asked. "I kept moving for several years, living modestly, making small anonymous donations to Detroit community groups when I could do so safely. But I was always looking over my shoulder, afraid of being caught. It was no way to fulfill the purpose of what we'd done." Thunder crashed outside, the storm reaching its peak intensity. "In early 1982, I took a risk. I reached out to Thomas. He'd been back in Millfield for years by then, working at the local bank branch, rebuilding his life. When the factory announced its closure, he saw an opportunity, a struggling town that needed investment, a place where the stolen money could finally do the good it was intended for. "So you came to Millfield," Eleanor said, the pieces falling into place. "Yes, Thomas introduced me to Samuel Winters, asked him to keep my arrival quiet. We created a new background for me, Walter Coleman, the successful Detroit real estate investor. Thomas helped me establish the foundation, structure the investments, create legitimate channels for the funds. Everything was designed to ensure the money would continue helping people long after both of us were gone." Eleanor struggled to process the implications. "My father was a thief. Your father was a man who couldn't stand by while others suffered from injustice," Walter corrected gently. "The bank stole from those communities first, Eleanor. Thomas simply took back what had been taken. Not for himself, he never touched a penny of that money. Everything went into the foundation." "Why are you telling me this now?" Eleanor asked. "You could have denied everything, claimed I had no proof." Walter smiled sadly. "I'm an old man, my time is growing short, and I've carried this secret long enough. And you're Thomas's daughter, you deserve to know who your father really was. Not a perfect man, perhaps, but a good one who made a difficult choice for the right reasons." Eleanor stood and moved to the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. Her entire understanding of her father had been upended, yet strangely, the revelation didn't diminish him in her eyes. If anything, it cast his quiet integrity in a new light, a man who'd risked everything to right a wrong, then spent the rest of his life ensuring that risk served its purpose. "These records," she said finally, turning back to Walter and indicating the safe. "They document everything. The original embezzlement, my father's involvement, the foundation's use of the funds." Walter nodded. "Every transaction, every decision, every dollar spent over 40 years. I've maintained them meticulously, the full accounting, as Thomas called it. Why keep such incriminating evidence? Because the truth matters, even if it remains private, and because I always believed that someday someone might need to understand the full story." Walter regarded her with weary eyes. "Question now, Eleanor, is what you intend to do with this information." Before she could answer, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Mike Hayes, the police chief. "Rumors spreading at festival about Walter Coleman's past. Crowd gathering, some angry. Where are you?" Eleanor showed the message to Walter, whose face paled. "How could they know?" he asked. "James Williams," Eleanor realized. "When I confronted him about Walter Evans, he must have started making calls, trying to get ahead of the story." "James knows only fragments," Walter said, shaking his head. "He discovered some inconsistencies in my background years ago, but I never told him about Thomas. He believes I acted alone." Another text from Mike. "Situation escalating. Several business owners claiming Walter's foundation built on fraud. Need to find him before crowd does." "We need to go," Eleanor said urgently. "Get your records and anything else important." "We can clarify the situation, explain that the beloved heart of this community is built on stolen money," Walter interrupted. "That everything they've believed about me for 40 years is a carefully constructed lie, that their local hero, Thomas Jenkins, was the architect of it all. The truth is more complicated than that," Eleanor insisted. "Truth often is," Walter agreed. "But people prefer simple narratives, heroes and villains, right and wrong. The gray areas get lost in the retelling." Eleanor's journalistic instincts warred with personal loyalty. The story of Walter Coleman and her father was exactly the kind of complex, morally ambiguous narrative she'd built her career revealing. Yet the consequences of exposure would reach far beyond Walter or her father's legacy. "We still need to leave," she said finally. "The storm's getting worse, and if people are angry enough to form a mob, staying here isn't safe." Walter began gathering folders from the safe, placing them in the worn leather satchel Eleanor had noticed earlier. "There's a back exit through the kitchen," he said. "My car is in the garage." As they prepared to leave, the sound of vehicles pulling up outside reached them. Headlights swept across the windows, followed by the slamming of car doors and voices raised against the storm. "Walter Coleman," a voice shouted from the front yard. "We know you're in there. Come out and explain yourself." Eleanor peeked through the curtains. A group of about 20 people had gathered in the front yard, some holding umbrellas against the rain, others seemingly indifferent to the downpour. She recognized business owners, foundation board members, and other community figures, people whose livelihoods and reputations were entangled with Walter's. "They've found us," she told Walter. "We need to talk to them, try to defuse this before it escalates further." Walter clutched the satchel containing 40 years of secrets. "And say what, Eleanor? What explanation could possibly satisfy them now?" Eleanor took a deep breath. The truth, or at least part of it. We emphasized that every penny went to the community, that no one was personally enriched. Walter considered this, then nodded slowly. Very well, but Eleanor, leave Thomas out of it. Let me be the villain of this story if there must be one. Your father's memory deserves better. Eleanor wanted to protest, but saw the determination in Walter's eyes. This was his final act of protection for his long-ago friend. They moved to the front door as the shouting outside grew louder. Eleanor stepped onto the porch first, Walter behind her, his frail figure somehow dignified despite the circumstances. The crowd fell silent momentarily at their appearance, rain continuing to pour around them. Eleanor recognized James Williams among them, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. "Get back, everyone, get back!" Eleanor shouted, her press badge swinging wildly as she positioned herself between the angry crowd and Walter. The rain poured mercilessly, soaking through her coat as lightning illuminated the faces of the mob. "He's a fraud, a thief who's been lying to this community for decades," a man from the crowd yelled, his voice carrying above the storm. Others joined in, their accusations growing more venomous by the second. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. After 30 years as a journalist, she'd never found herself physically defending a subject of her investigation. The irony wasn't lost on her. 2 weeks ago, she'd come to Millfield to expose Walter Coleman herself. Now she was his only shield against a community consumed by misplaced rage. "You don't understand," Eleanor pleaded, her voice breaking. "The documents in that satchel, they prove everything." Walter's eyes met hers, filled with a resignation that broke her heart. "Perhaps it's time, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Maybe some truths aren't meant to be protected." As the crowd closed in, Eleanor felt her phone vibrate. The message that flashed across the screen was from Mike Hayes. "On my way with officers. Keep everyone calm." "Please, listen to me," Eleanor shouted over the storm. "Walter Coleman took money from a bank in Detroit 40 years ago, that's true, but every penny of that money came to Millfield. Every building, every scholarship, every job created, that's where the money went. Not to personal gain, not to luxury, to all of you." The crowd hesitated, murmurs replacing shouts as they processed her words. "I don't care where the money came from." James Williams stepped forward suddenly. "I care about the lies. A foundation built on deception cannot stand." "No foundation is built on perfect truth, James," Walter said, his voice surprisingly strong as he moved beside Eleanor on the porch steps. "We all carry our secrets, our mistakes, our regrets. What matters is what we build despite them." The rain began to ease slightly, as if nature itself were pausing to listen. "I won't deny the essential truth," Walter continued. "I was Walter Evans once. I took money that wasn't mine. But what I've done with that money, what we've all done together in this community, that truth stands on its own." A police cruiser pulled up, lights flashing. Mike Hayes emerged, quickly assessing the situation. "Folks, this isn't how we handle things in Millfield," he called out, authority in his voice. "Whatever grievances you have, forming an angry mob in a thunderstorm isn't the solution." "He stole millions," someone shouted. "Our whole town is built on stolen money." "And would you rather it had never come here?" Eleanor challenged. "Would you undo the community center, the scholarships, the businesses that survived because of foundation grants? Would you erase 40 years of growth and opportunity?" The crowd fell silent, the moral complexity of the situation sinking in. These weren't simple questions with easy answers. Walter stepped forward, gently moving past Eleanor. "Friends, neighbors," he addressed them, rain streaming down his face. "I've lived among you for 4 decades. You've known me by my actions, my commitments, my love for this community. That was never a lie, even if my name and history were." He opened the satchel, revealing the meticulously kept records. "Every dollar accounted for, every decision documented. I've carried the weight of this secret not to protect myself, but to protect what we built together." An elderly woman stepped forward from the crowd, Marge from the festival. "I don't care what you did before Millfield, Walter. I care about what you've done here." She turned to the others. "My grandson got through college on a Coleman scholarship. My daughter's business survived because of a foundation grant. Are we going to reject all that because of something that happened before many of us were even born?" Others began to nod, the initial anger giving way to more nuanced consideration. Black and white certainty of betrayal blurred into shades of gray. Mike Hayes took control of the situation, organizing people to return to their vehicles, promising a proper town meeting to address concerns once the storm passed. James Williams remained, his expression troubled as he approached Walter. "Why didn't you trust me with the truth?" he asked quietly. "All these years, preparing me to take over the foundation." "Because you needed to believe in what you were doing without reservation," Walter answered. The Foundation's work had to stand separate from its origins in your mind, and perhaps I feared losing your respect. James absorbed this, then nodded slowly. We have a lot to discuss about the Foundation's future, but not tonight. He glanced at the dispersing crowd. I'll help Mike calm everyone down. As James left, Walter turned to Eleanor, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. So, Ms. Jenkins of the Chicago Tribune, what happens now? Will tomorrow's headline reveal the great fraud of Millfield? Eleanor looked at the satchel of records, at the town around them built on a complex mixture of deception and genuine good, at the elderly man who had carried her father's secret for decades. No, she said finally. Some stories serve no purpose in the telling, at least not in the way I initially imagined. The people of Millfield need to process this in their own way, find their own understanding of its meaning. Relief crossed Walter's face. And your father's role? Remains between us, Eleanor assured him. Though I would like to keep one copy of the records to understand him better, Walter nodded. Of course, Thomas would want you to know the full truth, even if no one else ever does. As the storm finally began to clear, revealing stars in breaks between the clouds, Eleanor realized she had found a different story than the one she'd come seeking. Not a simple exposé of fraud, but a complex narrative about justice, redemption, and the complicated ways people attempt to right past wrongs. The Coleman Foundation would continue under James's leadership, perhaps more transparent about its origins, but unchanged in its mission. Walter Coleman would remain a complicated figure in Millfield's history, part fraud, part savior, ultimately human in his imperfections and aspirations. And Thomas Jenkins would remain, in his daughter's heart at least, a man who had faced an impossible moral choice and chosen the path he believed would create the most good, accepting personal risk for collective benefit. As a journalist, Eleanor had spent her career pursuing truth, believing that exposure always served the greater good. Now she understood that truth itself was rarely simple, and its value lay not always in its revelation, but sometimes in how it was carried, protected, and ultimately used to create something better than what came before. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.